I would be the person in Parliament who never stopped raising the climate crisis as an issue. And I am that. Sadly, I'm the only one. There was a time when we used to think, and the media used to say, well, what are you going to do now? Everybody's caring about climate. Everybody's green. So there's no room for you. You must be so discouraged. Do they not have a single clue that we understand that what we're talking about is serious stuff? And we want everybody else to be concerned about it? The way media covers political parties in this country is an absolute sin and a tribute to the dumbing down of anything that matters. And it drives me beyond the bend that they would think I would mind if another party actually wanted to do something so that our children had a future. We want to hog this issue for ourselves so that in 50 years, when we form a majority government, we can do something about greenhouse gas emissions when it's too late to make a difference. That part drives me nuts. But I never really thought the other things that I'd end up doing, which I can look on now of 2.5 years in office, have been much more about what Adrian was talking about at the municipal level, which is fighting for democracy. Trying to say, look, I'm going to, as a member of Parliament, these things shouldn't be startling. I'm going to actually work in the House of Commons. I did an interview earlier today with Maclean's magazine. I'm apparently, last year, Maclean's every year does this thing where they hand out ballots to all members of Parliament. And other than electing the Speaker of the House, which is a secret ballot, there are no secret ballots in the House of Commons. And of course, Maclean's magazine contests aren't actually votes in the House of Commons, but it does happen to be a vote where the only people entitled to vote are members of Parliament. So the vote ends up with who's the Parliamentarian of the Year, and to my complete shock, last year I won. Yeah. I can be really sure I'm going to get all the votes of everyone in my party. But I have to get a lot of votes from the NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives in order for that to happen, right? And probably the Bloc guys too. So it's coming around again to the announcement of Maclean's Parliamentarian of the Year. And I'm a finalist for something. I don't know what. I can't imagine that it can't be Parliamentarian of the Year again, but it could be hardest working MP, it could be best orator, it might be Miss Congeniality. I don't know. But they were doing an interview with me today in preparation for the announcement next week when I'll be in Poland at the climate conference and miss the event. But Aaron Wary from Maclean's, who's a really nice guy, said, what gave you the idea that it would be a good idea to spend every day in the House of Commons working? I suppose if I thought the most important thing I could possibly be doing right now is to build the Green Party from coast to coast, I probably wouldn't be spending my time in the House of Commons every single day reading the legislation, which, shocker, I hate to tell you this, I'm the only member of Parliament who reads the legislation. But anyway, I probably, if I thought that was the most important thing, if I was looking for the strategy that would be the most useful for selling party memberships and getting across the country, and if I thought that was my most important job, I guess I wouldn't be in the House of Commons every single day, if that's what you mean by strategy. But since I think the most important thing I should be doing, and my highest priority, is to be the best member of Parliament the constituents of Saanich-Gulf Islands have ever had, then I rather think they expect me to show up for work. Right? That this is the role of a member of Parliament, just as Adrian shows up and works so hard in municipal council. The fact that this is even a question, I think, is a sign of how bad things have gotten in terms of the overlay of political party control over what members of Parliament actually do once they're elected. And according to our Constitution and according to our traditions as a Canadian democracy, we draw our traditions from Westminster parliamentary democracy, political parties aren't even part of the equation. The notion is that you actually, as citizens in a democracy, elect someone to represent you in Parliament. And all of us as members of Parliament should be working for our constituents. So the kinds of things I've been doing, another one is, I didn't think this would be a big shocker, putting all my expenses up online, scanning the receipts and putting them online, and And the first time I hadn't been elected very long, we had a call from CBC, and I'd already been, when I was running for office, I promised my constituents that this was something I would do. So when CBC called and said they were going to do a website, and they were asking all members of Parliament who was willing to provide their expenses so they could all be put on this website. And my chief of staff, who's one of my best friends who worked with me for the last 10 years, we worked together at Sierra Club. So I said to Deborah, this is great. This is going to save us a lot of time because we're just going to have to send our receipts to CBC and they'll scan them and put them online. We're not going to have to do it ourselves because they're starting this website. So a couple of months went by and the receipts were piling up, and I said, have they asked for them? We called and said, we're not doing that project because you were the only MP who agreed. Rats. So we put all our expenses online. All my expenses are online, and they're scanned. And there's some very funny stories actually. They didn't really. None of the media noticed my expenses were all scanned and online until recent other expense stories began to get noticed. And Tim Harper from the Toronto Star wrote a hysterical piece about reading my online expenses. So he could sort of mind-numbing detail, like what the hall on Galiano Island cost to rent for a town hall, and what we pay the cleaning lady for the office in Sydney, and that my staff does seem to run out for organic half and half a fair bit. So, I mean, Jesus, it was very funny. The other thing I do in Parliament is zero tolerance for heckling. That seems to be, I find it works. I'm very rarely heckled because not only do I refuse to heckle other people, if when I am speaking, other people heckle me, I stop talking and sit down. And then 9 times out of 10, not always, but 9 times out of 10, the speaker stands, calls for order because he can see that I've stopped talking because of the din around me. At which point he calls for order, 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 order. The honourable member for Saanich-Gulf Islands has the floor, order. And then they all quiet down, and then I can ask my question or make my point with a nice, calming, soothing silence around me, which is what we should have when someone else is talking, because it actually violates Standing Order 17 to interrupt a parliamentarian when they're speaking. Anyway, I'm loving what I'm doing. I've learned a lot about what's wrong with democracy in Canada by serving in the House of Commons. It has reached a very fevered pitch of perversion of democracy. It's very hard to actually make the case that we have a functioning democracy. One of my friends, a journalist who passed away about 2 years ago, Jim Travers, who was at one point the publisher and editor of the Ottawa Citizen and then the Toronto Star, and he and I were actually doing we were on something of a little panel with Michael Enright for Sunday edition. And my book, Losing Confidence, had just come out, so it would have been spring of 2009. And Michael Enright turned to me and said, so Elizabeth, what's your thesis here? You're calling your book Losing Confidence, the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. What makes you think Canadian democracy is in crisis? So I rhymed off the things that were preoccupying me at that time, things like low voter turnout, the fact that Stephen Harper had shut down the House of Commons to avoid a vote he knew he was going to lose with the prorogation of the fall of 2008, the fact that we had an election in which the RCMP had intervened to change the results of the outcome in 2006. I mentioned some of these things that suggested that we didn't have a very healthy democracy. And then Michael Enright turned to his sober voice of male experience and so much older, and I was not sure what Jim Travers would say. He said, so Jim, is Elizabeth exaggerating? And he said, no, Michael, I think she's understating the problem. And he said, you can visit Ottawa today, and what you'll find is a democracy theme park. All the buildings are still there, and you can tour them. You can see Parliament, and you can see it. So, I mean, this is things have come, and since then things have gotten much, much worse. Because when we were doing that interview, Stephen Harper had a minority of the seats, and wasn't able to do the full throttle assault on democracy, which has occurred since they got the majority of the seats with the minority of the votes. So such things have happened since the majority occurred as nothing but omnibus budget bills, the complete evisceration of our environmental legislation across Canada, the repeal of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and one thing that's really dangerous that nobody has written about in the national media for sure, well, we do hear about the muzzling of scientists, and this is a part of that, is that any previous prime minister, no matter how much previous prime ministers would be referred to as dictators. Jeffrey Simpson wrote a book about Jean Chrétien called The Benign Dictatorship. But every previous prime minister has known that the civil service is sacrosanct. The civil service is professional, expert, and although you don't have to take their advice, you can't manipulate their advice. Evidence-based decision-making requires that the civil service is able to develop information and provide it to decision makers who are politicians, and they'll make their decisions based on, by their own ideological lights, something based on the evidence before them. What's changed in the last 2.5 years has been that the Prime Minister's office, partisan staff has felt emboldened to attack civil servants wherever they are, at whatever level of bureaucracy, junior, senior, whatever, are subject to harassing phone calls from political staffers to tell them what they can and can't say, what they can and can't publish. And so I think this is probably the most dangerous development and one of the hardest things to identify for Canadians, because so far it's pretty much invisible. Which is just to say that my views about the significance and, in fact, the necessity of electing more Greens, municipally, provincially, and federally. Yes, it's still about we need climate action, and we need a voice, no matter if it's one voice or many voices are better. We need a consistent reminder to those who forget because it's not in the media, so they don't bother covering it, so they don't bother being engaged in the issue. And that's, unfortunately, at this point, the federal Liberals and New Democrats have accepted that Stephen Harper won't do anything about climate, and that they don't really care to work on that issue as long as the media pays no attention to it. So yes, it's critical that we have more Greens to address issues like the climate crisis. But I think it's even more critical to get more of us elected so that we can model the kind of behavior we'd like to see in the other parties so that they no longer tolerate, as members of parliament, being told what to do every single day. So that they see that it's possible, as we believe as Greens, that we'll never have a whipped vote, that you have the responsibility to represent your constituents first and foremost, and your party secondarily. And that's a core value of Greens around the world, is the commitment to grassroots democracy. So I'm now really excited to share with you a little bit before I stop talking about all of these things. But I wanted to share that our goals for the next federal election it'll be so wonderful when achieved. The goal is to have a full parliamentary caucus of 12 federal members of parliament, so that we have the additional resources for research, so that we have the capacity to make a big difference. But beyond that, so that we can, as a party with enough members to model behavior, prove to Canadians that you can be a party bound together by shared values that doesn't insist on treating their members of parliament as mere automatons capable of no more than reading out a script written by others, voting the way they're told, and not representing their constituents. So once we have 12 MPs, and we are very, very, very focused on this, with a plan that involves identifying well before the election those best chances and targeting resources in those places. We do plan to run candidates in every riding across Canada, but it will be clear that some ridings are where we are determined in this riding we will be electing a Green MP, and we certainly hope that the voters in that riding will get as excited about that prospect as we are. We know that in ridings across Canada, particularly in British Columbia, if you look at where you see voter turnout going up, it's when Greens have a chance of winning. My riding of Saanich-Gulf Islands had the highest voter turnout of any riding in Canada in 2011, just under 75%. you know, the classic thing that you run into as Greens, and I'm sure your friends have said this to you, oh, but what about vote splitting? That's not a problem in Canada. The problem that we have isn't vote splitting, it's vote abandoning. And if you consider the 2011 election, the largest voting bloc in Canada in 2011, 40% of the Canadian public, by far the largest voting bloc in that election, could have formed a majority government. But they would have had to call themselves something new, the we didn't bother to vote party, we stayed home party. The largest voting bloc in Canada was the people who didn't vote. So when we can provide something for people that engages and excites and inspires people to actually get out and vote, we're not vote splitting, we're vote expanding, we're vote engaging. We're reminding Canadians that voting is about choosing your own future and not voting out of fear or that nonsense of strategic voting, but actually voting for what you want. Now, to get from here in 2013 to 2015 with a full caucus of 12 Green MPs, while incidentally making sure, and this is going to be tough, we're the only party federally committed to finding strategies for cooperation with other parties. And the goal of cooperation for us is finding a way to cooperate with the objective of eliminating the first past the post voting system so that we never have the specter of if you vote for that guy you might elect by accident that person, we can't stand up. We've got to get rid of first past the post. Now the chances of getting cooperation, I'll keep trying. Right now the indicators aren't encouraging, but I will keep trying. I've mentioned a couple times tonight that I leave Saturday morning early for Warsaw. This is the 19th Conference of the Party of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Canadian official delegation will be led by our new Minister of Environment, Leona Aglukkaq. Traditionally, going back decades and decades, Canadian delegations to international events, and this is something you probably heard. I heard a lot of people talk about Joe Clark's interviews earlier today. I didn't hear them, but I'm sure Joe Clark would have made this kind of point, that in the past, our delegations went to international meetings representing Canada. And now we go to international meetings representing the Conservative Party of Canada. So the idea of having, it was absolutely, it wasn't even considered as a question in the past that opposition members of Parliament would be included on the government delegation. You're going as Canada. So, I mean, in the Rio Earth Summit, Mulroney brought along not just, it was Environment Development Conference, so Paul Martin was there as the Liberal Environment critic, and Christine Stewart was there as the Liberal Development critic, and Jim Fulton was there as the NDP Environment critic. I'm trying to remember who the NDP Development critic was. Plus, there was funding for representatives from First Nations, environmental groups, development organizations, women's organizations, youth, and labor, and there were also spots in the delegation for industry, but they paid their own way. The other categories of civil society organizations were paid for through the Government of Canada, so that the delegation from Canada was really from Canada. And now, I mean, Jim Prentice briefly went back to the practice of having opposition members of Parliament on the delegation. But for most of the time that Stephen Harper has been Prime Minister, members of Parliament from opposition parties are not included. So when Leona Aglukkaq became Minister of Environment, I wrote her to say, given that Jim Prentice did include opposition members of Parliament, I wrote to ask, do you think you will be including opposition members of Parliament on the delegation? It's a question one wants to know. And the sad thing about this situation, and when I think about it, I don't pause to think of it often, but when I do, I find it shocking that when a member of Parliament, for that matter, leader of the Green Party, but any member of Parliament, writes a letter to the Minister of Environment, I didn't even get a note that said, we've received your letter and we'll get back to you. I didn't get an answer at all. And I asked in the House of Commons whether or not there would be, and I got the standard answer, this government is making great strides to protect the climate. So when I'm in Warsaw next week. I don't know how many of you heard that the head of the Philippine delegation, who's a climate scientist, whose family, he didn't even know what the fate of his own family was as he went to Warsaw. His own brother had been literally with his bare hands pulling bodies out of the rubble. Well, his brother, the climate scientist, said to the assembled group in Warsaw that the climate crisis is madness, this typhoon is madness, and when we're gathered here and told we can accomplish nothing, we must stop the madness. And in these weeks of negotiation, because there are 2 weeks of negotiation, we're at the midpoint this weekend, and I'll be there for the second week, which is called the high level, when most of the politicians and ministers come. So this wonderful young head of the Philippine delegation said, as a sign that we must move forward and that we will not accept this ongoing inaction, this procrastination that pretends we can wait forever, I will be fasting as a reminder that we need action here in Warsaw. So I will join him in a fast while in Warsaw, and I've heard from colleagues in Warsaw that many other delegates are. That they've started adopting a little pin on their lapels so people will know that they have joined in the fast. And I will be, as a Canadian in Warsaw, among the most despised people there, because Canadians are no longer respected in international meetings. When I go to international meetings, the last point when I was in Durban, and I'm sorry, I'm probably going on too long, but when I was in Durban at the climate negotiations there, I managed to get credentials since I was not part of the Canadian government delegation. I could go with observer status as an NGO within the Global Greens Network. And so I had some way to show up and be there. And I didn't find out until when I went for my accreditation that my efforts through requests on emails to a friend, a colleague, can't say friend, a man I respect enormously. His name is Kevin Conrad, and some of you may remember that in the Bali negotiations, there was a very dramatic moment where, in the face of the Bush administration trying to stop climate action going forward, this one delegate said, respectfully, I ask the colleagues from the United States of America, if you can't lead, at least get out of the way. Now that was a man named Kevin Conrad, who was head of the delegation for Papua New Guinea. So when I got to Durban, through emails back and forth with Kevin Conrad, yes, it turned out they'd approved it so that I could be on the official government delegation of Papua New Guinea, which meant that I could get in all the rooms and keep track of what Peter Kent was up to. That was worth doing. Now, it meant, though, that for people who knew me from previous COPs, they knew I was Canadian, because a lot of people keep, obviously, negotiators, climate scientists, and they'd look at my pink badge and say, but you're Canadian, why are you wearing a badge from Papua New Guinea? The experience was really horrific when I'd meet people for the first time, because they'd smile and say, oh, you're from Papua New Guinea. And I'd say, well, actually, no, I'm a Canadian member of Parliament. Why the hell are you people even here? And I said, I'm sorry, I'm the leader of the Green Party. I don't care who you are. I got this all the time. Canadians don't belong here. Go home. We don't want you here. You've been destroying this process for years. Why do you even bother to keep coming? This is not a random one-off. This is the response you get as a Canadian to a global meeting. So I'm just hoping that when they realize I'm Canadian, at least they'll see I'm also fasting, and that I'm ashamed to be from one of the wealthiest countries on earth with the capacity to get this right, that's been standing in the way, blocking action. What we do globally is not just that we pollute from the oil sands. The worst of what we do is that we obstruct those countries that want action. We root for the laggards and we block progress. I will do everything I can when I go to those global meetings to make sure that people understand around the world that Leona Aglukuk represents the 24% of Canadian conservative voters who got themselves to the polls in a dysfunctional electoral system that allowed a majority of seats to be occupied by a party that got 39% of the actual votes, when 40% of Canadians stayed home. And we must vow now, today, that we will do those things. Adrienne said she needs to have Greens in the Vancouver Council, and that Adam Olsen and Andrew Weaver need to have Greens in the provincial legislature, and that we will need to have Greens elected federally. We must ensure that every friend we meet, every acquaintance we make, understands that this is not a time when we're allowed to sit it out. We're not allowed to wait till the situation gets better and then we might vote, or then we might donate, or then we'll show up on a blockade, but later. Now's the time for each and every one of us to be absolutely determined and single-minded and adopt a form of moral courage that says no matter how bad things look, I don't give up. I'm dragging my friends to the poll. I'm making donations beyond what I really intended to make. I'm going to organize. I'm going to run for office. I'm going to work for my friends who are running. And I am not going to let this country that's so beautiful and so fantastic be viewed on the world stage as a country that doesn't give a damn about the people who are drowning. Thank you.
After that, I got nothing. What can I say now? Nothing. It's amazing, Elizabeth. And thank you for being who you are, because, yeah, I'm one of those people. I'm one of those people, too. When I hear you speaking, I go, now that's somebody in a position of power that I believe in. You know, and I just listen to all these other people on the news and the media and all the politicians. I just think, who are these people? Like, seriously, like, where do they come from? Like, some of the attitudes and the behaviors, what we're seeing, it's just, it's inconceivable. It's inconceivable. I don't know how this happened. I left Canada for a number of years, and I came back 3 years ago, and I see this, and I have this experience myself. And I have this experience where I'm like, what happened? What happened? And yeah, I mean, I was living in BC and went to college here, and it seemed like there was sort of an environmental consciousness that was sort of pervading the space. And then it's like, what happened to that? It didn't really go anywhere. And we have one, Green in the House of Commons speaking for probably, like you said, 80% of Canadians. How did that happen? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to probably any of us.